The clock on the wall read 11:30 p.m. Dae-hyun sat alone in suffocating darkness, his silhouette framed against the glowing Manhattan skyline. A predator in a $15 million cage, he watched the door, driven to madness by the absence of his maid. The silence in the penthouse wasn't empty. It was a pressurized chamber, thick with the scent of expensive sandalwood and the cold metallic tang of an impending storm. Kang Dae-hyun didn't move. He sat on the black leather sofa, his legs spread wide, one arm draped over the backrest while the other held a dying cigarette. The embers glowed like a vengeful eye in the dark. He was the head of the Kang Syndicate, a man whose name was whispered with terror from the docks of Jersey to the high-rises of Wall Street. Yet here he was, reduced to counting the rhythmic ticks of a grandfather clock. Every second that Amara Vance was late felt like a personal insult, a hairline fracture in the absolute control he maintained over his world. When the heavy oak door finally groaned open at 12:03 a.m., the sound sliced through the stillness like a blade. Amara stepped inside, her silhouette framed by the dim light of the hallway. She looked exhausted, her shoulders slumped beneath the weight of a worn tan blazer that had seen better days at Columbia University. Her hair, usually pinned back with clinical precision, was beginning to fray at the edges, soft curls escaping to frame a face that held a stubborn, quiet beauty. She didn't see him at first. She moved toward the kitchen with the practiced silent gait of someone who had spent months learning the geography of a stranger's home in the dark. "You're late." The voice didn't just break the silence. It commanded it. Amara flinched, her hand flying to her chest as she spun toward the shadows. Dae-hyun stood up, his tall, imposing frame unfolding like a jagged shadow. As he stepped into the sliver of moonlight filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the light caught the intricate black ink that crawled up his neck, dragons and jagged geometric lines that served as armor for the man beneath. His silk shirt was unbuttoned halfway down, revealing the hard planes of a chest marked by more than just art. "Mr. Kang," she breathed, her voice steadying despite the visible tremor in her fingers. "You scared me. I didn't realize you were still awake." "I don't sleep until I know my assets are where they belong," he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. He crossed the floor with a predatory grace, stopping only when he was inches from her, forcing her to tilt her head back to meet his gaze. His eyes were cold, dark pools of suspicion. "Where were you, Amara? This is the third time this week you've missed your curfew." Amara tightened her grip on her bag, the leather strap digging into her shoulder. She felt the heat radiating from him, a physical force that threatened to overwhelm her senses. "I told you when I took this job, Mr. Kang. My personal time is my own. As long as the house is spotless and your meals are prepared, my whereabouts shouldn't concern you." Dae-hyun's jaw tightened, a small muscle leaping in his cheek. He reached out, his thumb catching her chin and forcing her to maintain eye contact. The contact was electric, a spark of friction in the cold room. "Nothing in this house is personal when you live under my roof. You are an employee of the Kang estate. If you are out until midnight, you are a liability. Or perhaps," he leaned closer, his breath ghosting over her lips, "you've found something or someone more interesting than your duties here." The accusation hung in the air, foul and heavy. Amara's eyes flashed with a sudden, fierce fire. She wasn't just a maid. She was a woman who had once been at the top of her class, a woman who had sacrificed her future to save her mother's life. To have this man, who bought and sold people like currency, imply she was some common tryst-seeker was more than her pride could bear. She stepped back, breaking his hold, her face a mask of defiant calm. "I am not one of your soldiers, and I am certainly not one of your playthings," she snapped. "I was at the library, studying. Because, unlike you, I don't plan on spending the rest of my life in the shadows, wondering who is going to stab me in the back. I have a life to rebuild." Dae-hyun let out a short, harsh laugh that held no humor. "The library. At midnight. You lie as poorly as you clean, Amara. I know how the world works. People don't stay out late for books. They stay out for secrets. They stay out for betrayals. He stepped into her personal space again, his presence suffocating. I've had people killed for less than the suspicion you're creating right now. Then kill me, she challenged, her voice a whisper that carried the weight of a scream. It would be easier than dealing with this suffocating paranoia. You sit up here in your ivory tower, obsessed with doors and clocks, because you're terrified that for once, there's something you can't control. Well, here's a reality check. You don't own me. You own my time from 6 to 10. Everything else belongs to me. She turned to walk away, but his hand shot out, gripping her upper arm. It wasn't enough to hurt, but it was an absolute claim of authority. For a moment, the air between them was thick with an unspoken tension, a volatile mix of anger and an attraction neither was willing to admit. Dae-hyun looked down at her, his gaze dropping to her lips before snapping back to her defiant eyes. He saw the Columbia ghost in her, the brilliance she tried to hide behind floor wax and laundry detergent. Tomorrow, he said, his voice dropping to a whisper that felt like a threat and a promise all at once. You will be home by 10. If you are a minute late, I will find out exactly what you are doing in the dark. And believe me, Amara, you won't like the way I extract the truth. He let her go, and she didn't look back as she retreated to her small room off the kitchen. Dae-hyun remained in the center of the room, the silence returning to claim the space. He looked at his hand, still feeling the warmth of her skin. He hated the way she looked at him, not with fear, but with a piercing clarity that seemed to see right through his armor to the scarred man beneath. Where are you watching from today? Let us know in the comments and join the family. The small, dimly lit room off the kitchen felt more like a sanctuary than a servant's quarters to Amara. It was the only place in the glass and steel fortress where she could breathe without feeling Dae-hyun's heavy, judgmental gaze on her neck. Sitting on the edge of her narrow bed, she pulled a weathered, leather-bound notebook from her bag. It was filled with complex financial formulas and scribbled notes on market volatility, the remnants of a life that had been snatched away just as it was beginning to bloom. 2 years ago, Amara Vance had been the star of Columbia's finance department. She was the girl with the golden ledger, a scholarship student from a tough neighborhood in Chicago who had clawed her way into the Ivy League on sheer brilliance. Her future was a mapped-out trajectory of corner offices and high-stakes trading. But life, she had learned, didn't care about blueprints. It started with a cough that wouldn't go away, then a series of tests, and finally the diagnosis that turned her world to ash. Her mother had a rare, aggressive form of stage 4 cancer. The medical bills had been a tidal wave. Even with insurance, the experimental treatments and specialized nursing care cost more than Amara could make in 3 lifetimes of summer internships. She had sold her car, her books, and finally her pride. She had dropped out of her final semester, the Columbia ghost, vanishing from the halls of academia to chase the only thing that mattered, keeping her mother alive. The debt had eventually led her to a shadowy employment agency that specialized in placing discreet, high-level staff for the city's most dangerous elite. When she was offered $15,000 a month to be the live-in housekeeper for Kang Dae-hyun, she hadn't asked questions. She had looked at the balance of $47 in her savings account and signed the contract with a shaking hand. The memory of her first day in the penthouse flashed through her mind. She had expected a monster. Instead, she had found a man who seemed more like a ghost than she was. Dae-hyun had been sitting in that same spot on the sofa, his shirt off, allowing a doctor to stitch a jagged wound across his shoulder. He hadn't flinched, hadn't made a sound. He had simply looked at her with eyes that seemed to have seen the end of the world and said, "Don't touch my things. Don't speak unless spoken to. And never, under any circumstances, enter the office at the end of the hall." Since then, their relationship had been a cold war of silence and small rebellions. Amara performed her duties with clinical efficiency, but she refused to be the submissive maid he expected. When he left a diamond necklace on her dresser as a bonus after a particularly grueling week of hosting syndicate meetings, she had placed it back on his desk the next morning with a note. *, my salary is sufficient. I am not an asset for your collection. *. It was that refusal to be bought that seemed to frustrate him most. He was used to people, men and women alike, crumbling under his wealth or his violence. Amara did neither. She treated him like a man, not a kingpin, and it drove him to a state of constant, simmering agitation. Tonight, however, the agitation had reached a boiling point. Amara knew why she was coming home late, but she couldn't tell him. She had used her savings to enroll in one final grueling night course at a local satellite campus. If she could pass this, she could finish her degree online and finally escape this gilded cage. But to Dae-hyun, her absence was a blank space that his paranoia filled with shadows. She heard a soft knock at her door, not the heavy, authoritative thud of the boss, but the quick, rhythmic tap of Ji-hoon, Dae-hyun's second in command. "Amara, are you awake?" His voice was silk, masking the steel beneath. She opened the door slightly. Ji-hoon stood there, looking perfectly polished even at 1 a.m. He was the civilized face of the Kong Syndicate, the man who handled the digital and financial side of the business while Dae-hyun handled the blood. "The boss is in a state," Ji-hoon whispered, leaning against the doorframe. "He doesn't like mysteries, Amara. Especially mysteries involving the people in his house. If you're in some kind of trouble, if you owe money to the wrong people, you should tell me. I can help you before he decides you're a threat." Amara looked at him, her instincts screaming. Ji-hoon had always been helpful, but there was something in his eyes that reminded her of a shark circling a reef. "I'm not in trouble, Ji-hoon. I'm just tired. Tell Mr. Kong he has nothing to worry about." "I hope so," Ji-hoon said, a small, cold smile playing on his lips. Because when Dae-hyun worries, people usually start disappearing. It would be a shame for such a pretty, smart girl to become a footnote in the syndicate's history. He turned and walked away, leaving Amara shivering in the doorway. She went back to her bed and opened her notebook, but the numbers no longer made sense. She felt the walls of the penthouse closing in. The $15,000 a month was a lifeline, yes, but it was also a noose. She looked at a photo of her mother tucked into the back of the notebook. "Just a few more months," she whispered. "Just long enough to get the degree. Then we leave the shadows behind." But as she listened to the low murmur of voices from the living room, Dae-hyun and Ji-hoon discussing territory and liabilities, she realized that the shadows weren't just outside. They were in the air she breathed, in the floor she scrubbed, and in the dark, wounded heart of the man who watched her every move. The tension in the penthouse over the next few days was a living, breathing entity. Amara continued her routine with a mask of stoic professionalism, scrubbing the marble floors until they shone like mirrors and preparing meals that Dae-hyun barely touched. But the dynamic had shifted. Every time she moved through a room, she could feel his eyes tracking her, heavy with a mixture of suspicion and a dark, magnetic curiosity that made the hair on her arms stand up. On Tuesday morning, Amara entered her bedroom to find a velvet box sitting on her pillow. Inside was an exquisite Cartier watch, its face encrusted with paved diamonds that caught the morning light in a dazzling display of wealth. There was no note, but none was needed. It was an unbuttoned rule of their relationship. He attempted to buy her compliance, and she, in turn, refused to be a line item in his budget. She didn't even try it on. Instead, she took the box directly to the end of the long, shadow-swept hallway where his private office sat. This was the forbidden room, the one place her contract explicitly stated she was never to enter. She knocked once, firmly. "Come in." The voice was a low growl. Amara pushed the door open just enough to step inside. The office was a stark contrast to the rest of the minimalist penthouse. It was filled with dark mahogany, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, and a massive desk where Dae-hyun sat surrounded by 3 glowing computer monitors. He looked up, his silk shirt unbuttoned at the collar, revealing the jagged black ink of a dragon's tail curling toward his collarbone. "I believe you left this in the wrong room," Amara said, her voice steady as she placed the velvet box on the edge of his desk. Dae-hyun didn't look at the watch. He looked at her, his gaze lingering on the stubborn set of her jaw. "It wasn't a mistake, Amara. You're always checking the wall clocks. I thought you might appreciate something more efficient." "I appreciate things I've earned, Mr. Kong," she countered. "A gift of this magnitude isn't a bonus. It's an anchor. I don't want to owe you anything more than the hours I've contracted to give you." Dae-hyun leaned back, the leather of his chair creaking. Most women would have sold that watch by noon and been halfway to a vacation. "Why do you insist on making everything a battle of principles? You're a maid in a mafia boss's house, not a philosopher." "Maybe I'm both," she said, her eyes narrowing. "And maybe the reason you keep giving me these things isn't that you're generous, but because you're terrified that if you can't buy me, you can't control me." The air in the office suddenly felt thin. Dae-hyun stood up, his massive frame casting a long shadow over her. He walked around the desk, stopping just inches from her. The scent of sandalwood and expensive tobacco enveloped her. He reached out, his fingers grazing the collar of her tan blazer. The movement was surprisingly gentle for a man whose hands were stained with so much blood. "You have a very dangerous tongue, Amara Vance," he whispered. "You come into my home, you ignore my curfews, you return my gifts, and then you stand in my inner sanctum and lecture me on power. Do you have any idea how many people are buried in the Meadowlands for saying less to me than you just did?" "Then add me to the list," she challenged, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "But until you do, stop putting jewelry on my pillow. If you want to show me respect, show it by trusting that when I say I'm at the library, I'm at the library." Dae-hyun's hand dropped from her collar, his expression hardening into a mask of cold professionalism. "The office is off limits. You've broken the rule once. Don't do it again. And the watch stays on the desk. If you won't wear it, it can collect dust alongside everything else in this room that no longer serves a purpose." Amara turned to leave, but as she reached the door, she looked back. Dae-hyun was staring at the monitors, his face illuminated by the blue light of a dozen spreadsheets and surveillance feeds. He looked profoundly alone, a king in a fortress who didn't trust a single person inside his walls. As she walked back to the kitchen, she passed Ji-hoon in the hallway. He was leaning against the wall, a tablet in his hand, watching her with a cryptic expression. "You should have kept the watch," Ji-hoon said smoothly. "Dae-hyun doesn't like rejection. He views it as a form of rebellion. And in this house, rebellion is dealt with quite permanently." "I'm not afraid of him, Ji-hoon," Amara said, though her hands were shaking as she reached for her cleaning supplies. "That's the problem," Ji-hoon replied, his eyes returning to his screen. "You should be. Because when a man like Dae-hyun can't buy you, he starts looking for reasons to break you." Amara spent the rest of the afternoon scrubbing the baseboards in the guest wing, trying to drown out the memory of Dae-hyun's touch. She knew she was playing a dangerous game. She was a Columbia ghost, trying to outmaneuver a shark in his own waters. But as she checked her own cheap plastic digital watch, the one she had bought for $10 at a pharmacy, she felt a surge of defiance. Her time was her own. Her mind was her own. And no amount of diamonds or threats would ever change that. But as the sun began to set, casting long bloody streaks of orange across the Manhattan skyline, she couldn't help but wonder about the scars she had seen on Dae-hyun's chest. They weren't just physical. They were the marks of a man who had been betrayed so deeply that he no longer knew how to see the truth, even when it was standing right in front of him. The heat of the Manhattan summer had begun to settle into the penthouse, turning the glass walls into a greenhouse of shimmering light and stifling tension. Amara found herself working in a state of hyper-awareness, her ears tuned to the sound of Daehyun's footsteps. Since their confrontation in the office, a strange, silent truce had settled between them, though it felt more like the eye of a hurricane than actual peace. It was a Thursday afternoon when the air conditioning in the master suite began to hum with a discordant metallic rattle. Amara had been tasked with organizing the walk-in closet, a space larger than her entire apartment in Chicago, when she heard the heavy thud of the terrace door closing. She stepped out into the bedroom and froze. Daehyun was standing by the window, his back to her. He had discarded his shirt, likely due to the failing cooling system, and was staring out at the Hudson River. For the first time, Amara saw the full extent of the armor he wore. The tattoos were a masterpiece of ink, a swirling vortex of dragons, peonies, and ancient calligraphy that draped over his shoulders and down his spine. But as the afternoon sun hit his skin at a sharp angle, Amara saw what the ink was trying to hide. Beneath the vibrant black and red pigment were raised, jagged lines of silver scar tissue. They weren't just the clean lines of bullet wounds or the jagged edges of knife fights. Across his shoulder blades, there were long, intentional marks that looked like they had been carved with a surgeon's precision, or a torturer's. She must have made a sound, a small intake of breath, because Daehyun spun around with the speed of a coiled spring. His eyes were wide, a flash of raw vulnerability crossing his face before the mask of the syndicate boss slammed back into place. He reached for his silk shirt, draped over a nearby chair, and pulled it on with jerky, uncharacteristic haste. "I didn't hear you come in," he said, his voice unusually sharp. "I was in the closet." "I'm sorry," Amara stammered, her eyes dropping to the floor. "I didn't mean to see." Daehyun fumbled with the buttons, his fingers betraying a slight tremor. The man who could stare down a rival gang without blinking was visibly shaken by the fact that his housekeeper had seen his skin. "Go back to your work, Amara. I don't pay you to stare." "Those aren't just tattoos," she said softly, ignoring his command. Her academic mind, the one trained to look for patterns and root causes, wouldn't let it go. "The ink. It's a map, isn't it? You're trying to cover up the stories you don't want to tell." Daehyun stopped buttoning his shirt and looked at her. The anger in his eyes had faded, replaced by a weary, hollow look that made him appear older than his 34 years. "Everyone has stories they don't want to tell, Amara. Some of us just have them written on our bodies so we can't forget." He walked toward her, and for once the predatory energy was gone. He stopped a few feet away, the scent of his skin warm and vaguely like cedar, filling the space between them. "Do you want to know about the white scars? The ones the ink couldn't drown out?" Amara nodded, her heart racing. "They were a gift," he said, his voice dropping to a low, bitter rasp, "from a woman named Yuna, my fiancée. 7 years ago, I thought I was building a dynasty with her. I thought the syndicate was our future." He let out a dry, mirthless laugh. "She was working for the Philadelphia families the entire time. She didn't just want my territory. She wanted to see me broken. She kept me in a basement in Camden for 3 weeks while her brothers took turns marking me. She told me that every scar was a lesson in why trust is a luxury a man like me can't afford." Amara felt a physical ache in her chest. She thought of her own scars, the metaphorical ones left by her father's disappearance and her mother's illness. "Is that why you look at me like I'm a spy every time I'm 10 minutes late?" "Because of her." "I look at everyone like they're a spy, Amara," he replied, stepping closer until he could see the amber flecks in her dark eyes. "But with you, it's different. I look at you, and I see someone who shouldn't be here. I see a girl who returns diamonds and carries finance textbooks in a tan blazer. It doesn't make sense. And when things don't make sense, they're dangerous. I'm not dangerous, Dae-hyun, she whispered, using his name for the first time. He reached out, his hand hovering near her cheek before he pulled it back, as if afraid the contact would burn them both. You're the most dangerous thing in this house. Because you make me want to forget the lessons Yuna taught me. The moment was shattered by the sound of the suite door opening. Ji-hoon stepped in, his eyes darting between the two of them with clinical precision. He held a tablet in his hand, his expression unreadable. Dae-hyun, Ji-hoon said, his voice devoid of its usual smooth charm. We have a problem. The digital sweep of the house's internal network just flagged a series of unauthorized pings. Someone is sending encrypted files to an external server in Philadelphia. Dae-hyun's face turned to stone. The vulnerability she had seen seconds ago vanished, replaced by the cold, lethal gaze of the boss. He turned his head slowly to look at Amara, the warmth in the room evaporating instantly. Where is your phone, Amara? He asked, his voice a flat, terrifying monotone. In my room, she said, her confusion turning to a cold, creeping dread. Why? Dae-hyun didn't answer. He walked past her without a second glance, his silk shirt fluttering behind him like a funeral shroud. Ji-hoon followed him, pausing only to give Amara a look that was half pity, half triumph. Amara stood alone in the master suite, the humming of the broken air conditioner the only sound in the room. She realized then that the truce was over. The scars she had just seen weren't just history. They were a prophecy. And as she looked at the door where they had vanished, she knew that the ghost of Yuna had finally returned to finish what she started. The air in the penthouse had turned from stagnant to lethal. Amara stood in the center of the living room, her fingers curled tightly into the fabric of her tan blazer. She could hear the frantic clicking of keys from the office, a sound that felt like a countdown. For the first time, the vastness of the $15 million penthouse didn't feel like a luxury. It felt like a cage where the bars were made of suspicion and cold, hard data. Inside the office, Ji-hoon sat at the secondary monitor, his fingers flying across the mechanical keyboard with clinical precision. On the main screen, a series of red flashing windows illuminated Dae-hyun's face, casting his features in a bloody digital glow. I've traced the pings, Dae-hyun, Ji-hoon said, his voice dropping into a register of feigned regret. They're originating from a hidden partition on the house's internal server. It's sophisticated. Someone has been using the guest Wi-Fi credentials to bridge into our secure financial ledger. Dae-hyun stood behind him, his arms crossed over his chest. The silk shirt he had just buttoned was already rumpled, his posture rigid. And the destination? An IP address registered to a shell corporation in Philadelphia, Ji-hoon replied, hitting the enter key with a final sharp snap. The Morty Holdings. They're our primary rivals for the Jersey docks. And here, he pointed to a log on the screen, is the access timestamp. Every Tuesday and Thursday, between 8 p.m. and 11 p.m. Dae-hyun felt a cold pit open in his stomach. Those were the exact hours Amara was gone. The hours she claimed to be at the library. The logical, scarred part of his brain, the part Yuna had built with her betrayal, screamed that the coincidence was too perfect to be anything else. There's more, Ji-hoon continued, pulling up a scanned document. I did a deep dive into our payroll records. Look at the metadata on the bank account Amara provided for her mother's medical expenses. There's a secondary recurring deposit of $5,000. It's coming from a blind trust in the Cayman Islands. The same trust used by the Philadelphia families to pay their offshore contractors. It was a masterpiece of digital forgery. Ji-hoon had spent weeks carefully weaving these threads, planting the pings during the times he knew Amara was at her night classes and routing his own embezzlement through a series of proxies that led straight to her details. He had been skimming from the Kong syndicate for 3 years, and he needed a sacrificial lamb before Dae-hyun's quarterly audit uncovered the holes in the ledger. Dae-hyun walked out of the office, his footsteps heavy and deliberate. Amara was waiting in the hallway, her face pale but her eyes defiant. She looked at him, searching for the man who had almost touched her cheek in the bedroom, but he was gone. In his place was the architect of death, the man who had survived a Camden basement. Dae-hyun, I don't know what Ji-hoon told you, but I haven't done anything, she said, her voice trembling. The logs don't lie, Amara, he said, his voice a flat, dead thing. Every night you were studying, someone was bleeding my accounts into Philadelphia. Every night you came home late, you were selling me out to the people who want to see me in a grave. I was in class, she cried, reaching into her bag to pull out her notebook. I have my notes, my syllabus. Anyone can write in a notebook. Dae-hyun roared, his composure finally breaking. He snatched the bag from her hand and threw it across the marble floor. Textbooks and pens scattered like shrapnel. Yuna had a notebook too. She filled it with poems about our future while she was drawing maps of my safe houses for her brothers. Do you think I'm an idiot? Do you think I haven't seen this play before? Amara looked at the scattered remnants of her dream, the book she had worked 3 jobs to buy, and felt a cold, hard clarity settle over her. You aren't an idiot, Dae-hyun. You're a coward. You're so terrified of being hurt again that you'd rather believe a computer screen than the woman who has scrubbed your floors and looked you in the eye for 6 months. You're letting your past murder your present. Search her room, Dae-hyun commanded, looking over her shoulder at Ji-hoon. Ji-hoon moved past her, a shadow of suppressed triumph on his face. He spent 20 minutes tossing her small sanctuary. He tore the sheets from the bed, flipped the mattress, and dumped her meager belongings onto the floor. Finally, he emerged with a small, encrypted burner phone, one he had hidden behind the baseboard 3 days prior. Found it, Ji-hoon said, holding the device up between 2 fingers like it was a poisonous insect. It's a military-grade encryptor. Standard issue for the Morty's high-level assets. Dae-hyun looked at the phone, then at Amara. The betrayal felt fresh, a jagged blade twisting in the old scars on his back. He wanted to scream, to break something, to break her. But instead, he just felt empty. Put her in the guest room, Dae-hyun said, his voice barely a whisper. Lock the door. No one goes in, and she doesn't come out until I decide how to handle this. Dae-hyun, please, Amara said as Ji-hoon grabbed her arm. Look at the files yourself. If you're the genius everyone says you are, look at the code. Don't just take his word for it. But Dae-hyun had already turned his back. He walked to the window, staring out at the city lights. He felt the suffocating darkness of the penthouse closing in on him again, heavier than ever. He had tried to let someone in and they had tried to destroy him. Ji-hoon dragged Amara toward the guest wing. As they passed the shadows of the hallway, he leaned in close to her ear, his voice a venomous hiss. You were a good distraction, Amara. But the boss is right about one thing. This world is no place for a girl with a notebook. He shoved her into the room and turned the key. Amara sank to the floor, listening to the click of the lock. She wasn't crying. She was thinking. She was a finance major, a girl who understood logic, patterns, and risk. And she knew that in the digital world, every lie left a footprint. She just had to figure out how to get to the one room she was forbidden to enter. The guest room was a gilded cage, decorated in shades of taupe and charcoal that felt as cold as a mausoleum. Amara didn't pace. She sat on the edge of the bed, her mind working with the mechanical precision of a high-frequency trading algorithm. She knew how Dae-hyun operated. He was a man of patterns. He would spend the next few hours in his office, staring at the evidence Ji-hoon had provided, letting his old traumas rot his judgment until he convinced himself that killing her was the only way to protect his empire. The breaking point wasn't just about her safety. It was about the fundamental flaw in the man she was starting to love. If he couldn't see past the digital smoke Ji-hoon had blown in his face, then he was already dead, a hollow king ruled by the ghost of a woman who had betrayed him years ago. An hour into her confinement, the door clicked open. Dae-hyun stood in the frame, a bottle of expensive scotch in one hand and a glass in the other. He didn't look like a boss. He looked like a man who had been hollowed out. He walked into the room and sat in the armchair across from her, the shadows stretching long across his tattooed chest. "I looked at the burner phone," he said, his voice thick with the gravel of exhaustion and alcohol. "The last outgoing call was made 4 minutes before you walked through the door tonight. To a number in South Philly." "I didn't make that call, Dae-hyun," Amara said, her voice like a steady heartbeat in the silence. "Ji-hoon made it. Or he programmed the phone to do it automatically. If you look at the metadata." "Stop!" he roared, slamming the glass onto the side table. The scotch sloshed over the rim, staining the wood. "Stop talking about metadata and logic. My eyes see a girl who lied about where she was. My systems see a traitor. Why would Ji-hoon, my brother in arms for 10 years, betray me for a housekeeper he barely knows?" "Because he's not betraying you for me," Amara said, leaning forward, her eyes burning with a desperate intensity. "He's betraying you for the money he's been stealing. He's using your trauma as a shield. He knows that if he points a finger at a woman and calls her Yuna, you'll stop thinking and start bleeding." Dae-hyun flinched as if she'd struck him. He stood up, pacing the small room like a caged animal. "You know nothing about Yuna. You know nothing about what it feels like to have the person you sleep next to count the seconds until your execution." "I know what it feels like to be invisible," Amara countered, her voice rising to meet his. "I know what it feels like to be a Columbia ghost, who works 3 jobs just to keep her mother's heart beating. Do you really think I'd risk my mother's life, the only thing I have left, to play games with the Philadelphia Mafia? I'm a finance major, Dae-hyun. I understand ROI. The risk of betraying you doesn't yield the return I need. It's illogical." Dae-hyun stopped pacing and looked at her. For a moment, the status irony of their relationship was stripped away. They weren't boss and maid. They were 2 broken people standing in the dark, fighting for a truth that seemed just out of reach. He saw the fire in her eyes, the same fire that had made her return the diamonds and refuse his bonuses. "If you're lying," he whispered, stepping so close she could smell the peat and smoke on his breath, "I will be the one who ends you. I won't leave it to Ji-hoon. I won't leave it to the Mortys. I will dismantle everything you've worked for." "And if I'm telling the truth," Amara whispered back, her face inches from his, "you will have to admit that you've been living in a tomb for 7 years. You'll have to admit that you're terrified of the fact that I'm the only person in this city who doesn't want your money or your power." Dae-hyun reached out, his hand trembling as it hovered near her throat. He didn't know whether to strangle her or pull her into a kiss that would shatter them both. The tension was a physical cord, vibrating between them until it snapped. He pulled away abruptly, his face hardening into a mask of clinical detachment. "Ji-hoon is preparing the interrogation room in the basement," Dae-hyun said, his voice cold. "He wants to extract the encryption keys from you. He says it's the only way to be sure." Amara felt a chill run down her spine. An interrogation by Ji-hoon wouldn't be about information. It would be about making sure she never spoke again. "And are you going to let him?" Dae-hyun didn't answer. He walked to the door and paused with his hand on the handle. "I'm going back to the office. I'm going to look at the code one last time. If I find even a single pixel that doesn't align with your story, Amara, I'll give him the green light." He slammed the door and locked it. Amara sat back down on the bed, her heart hammering. She had reached the breaking point. She realized that Dae-hyun's vulnerable jealousy had blinded him, but she also realized she had a weapon he didn't expect. She knew the layout of the house's financial ledger because she had seen it over his shoulder. She knew where the holes would be. She looked at the window. It was 60 floors down to the street, but there was a narrow maintenance ledge that ran along the perimeter of the penthouse. It led directly to the exterior ventilation shaft of the forbidden office. She took off her tan blazer, folding it neatly on the bed, a final vestige of the girl she used to be. If she was going to prove her innocence, she had to stop being the maid and start being the shark. She had to enter the one room that was forbidden, and she had to do it before Ji-hoon came back with his extraction tools. The maintenance ledge was less than 12 inches of cold concrete, slick with the evening's condensation. Amara pressed her back against the glass of the penthouse, 60 stories of sheer drop pulling at her heels. The wind whipped her hair across her face, but she didn't look down. In her mind, she wasn't a maid dangling over an abyss. She was an analyst identifying a market opening. She reached the ventilation grate of the forbidden office, her fingers aching as she pried the metal loose with a heavy-duty letter opener she'd snatched from the guest room vanity. She tumbled into the office, landing silently on the plush Persian rug. The room was bathed in the ghostly blue light of the monitors. Dae-hyun wasn't there. He was likely in the kitchen or the basement, pacing out his indecision. Amara scrambled to the main desk, her heart drumming against her ribs. She didn't need a password. She had watched Dae-hyun type his credentials dozens of times while she dusted the bookshelves. Trust. No, 1-77. The irony stung as the desktop loaded. Her fingers flew across the keyboard. She didn't look at the surface-level folders Ji-hoon had flagged. She went deeper into the system's background processes. She opened the command prompt and ran a script to trace the origin of the Philadelphia pings. As the lines of code scrolled past, her eyes widened. The pings weren't coming from the guest Wi-Fi. They were being generated by a virtual machine hosted on the server's internal kernel, a ghost process that mirrored her movements. "Think, Amara," she whispered to herself. "If I'm the spy, where is the money?" She bypassed the Cayman Trust Ji-hoon had shown Dae-hyun and looked for discrepancies in the syndicate's primary washing accounts. There, hidden beneath 3 layers of subdirectories, she found it, a series of fractional transfers. Every time a shipment moved through the docks, 0.5% was being diverted. It was a classic salami slicing technique, too small to trigger an automated audit, but over 3 years, it totaled nearly $12 million. The destination wasn't Philadelphia. It was a private wallet tied to a real estate holding in Seoul. The owner of the holding? Park Ji-hoon. He wasn't just framing me, she realized, her breath hitching. He's been planning his exit for years. Suddenly, the heavy mahogany door groaned open. Amara froze, her hands still hovering over the glowing keys. She turned, expecting to see Dae-hyun's towering silhouette. Instead, she found herself staring into the cold, dead eyes of Ji-hoon. He wasn't wearing his suit jacket anymore. He had a silenced pistol in his hand, and his usual mask of polite subservience had been replaced by a look of sheer, predatory malice. "You really should have stayed in the guest room, Amara," Ji-hoon said, his voice a low, terrifying silk. "I underestimated you. I thought you were just a pretty distraction with a tragic backstory. I didn't realize you actually knew how to read a ledger." "You've been stealing from him since before I arrived," Amara said, her voice trembling but her gaze fixed on him. "The Philadelphia pings. They're a diversion. You're not working for the Mortys. You're working for yourself." Ji-hoon stepped into the room, kicking the door shut behind him. The lock clicked with finality. "Dae-hyun is a broken man, Amara. He's obsessed with ghosts and tattoos. He's lost the edge. He spent 12 hours debating whether to kill a girl who cleans his toilets while the world is moving on without him. He doesn't deserve this empire. He trusted you, Amara said, backing away until she hit the window. He called you his brother. Trust is a liability, Ji-hoon countered, raising the weapon. A lesson he learned from Yuna, and a lesson he's about to learn again. I'm going to kill you, delete those logs, and tell Dae-hyun you tried to escape through the vent. He's so blinded by his past that he'll believe it. He'll go to war with Philadelphia, and in the chaos I'll vanish with the rest of his treasury. Amara looked at the computer screen. The audit she had just run was still visible, the red text highlighting Ji-hoon's theft. She looked back at the man with the gun. She was out of time. You're right about one thing, Ji-hoon, she said, her voice gaining a sudden sharp edge. Dae-hyun is obsessed with the past, but he's also obsessed with surveillance. She reached out and hit a sequence of keys she had memorized, the hotkey for the house-wide intercom. Dae-hyun, she screamed, the sound echoing through every speaker in the $15 million penthouse. The office. He's been stealing for 3 years. The money is in Seoul. Ji-hoon is. A muffled thud rang out as Ji-hoon fired. The bullet shattered the monitor inches from Amara's head, showering her in glass and sparks. She dove behind the heavy mahogany desk as Ji-hoon lunged forward, his face contorted in rage. You stupid bitch, he roared, firing again. The bullet embedded itself in the wood of the desk. Amara scrambled toward the far side of the room, her hand catching on the letter opener she had dropped. It wasn't a gun, but it was steel. As Ji-hoon rounded the corner of the desk, his finger tightening on the trigger for the kill shot, the office door didn't just open, it exploded inward. Dae-hyun charged into the room like a force of nature. He didn't have a weapon. He didn't need one. His face was a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. Not the calculated rage of a boss, but the raw, primal protectiveness of a man who had finally realized what he was about to lose. Drop it, Dae-hyun growled, his voice vibrating in the floorboards. Ji-hoon hesitated, the barrel of his gun wavering between Amara and the man who had been his brother. The silence in the room was so thick it felt like it might shatter. I loved you like a brother, Dae-hyun whispered, his eyes fixed on the traitor. But you framed the woman I love. And for that, there is no redemption. The air in the forbidden office was charged with a lethal electricity. Ji-hoon stood like a cornered animal, his eyes darting between the man he had served for a decade and the woman who had unraveled his 3-year masterpiece in a single night. The silence was absolute, broken only by the hum of the one remaining monitor and the ragged breathing of Amara, who remained crouched behind the mahogany desk, her fingers white-knuckled around the letter opener. Put the gun down, Ji-hoon, Dae-hyun said, his voice dropping into a register that was lower and more dangerous than any shout. He didn't move toward him. He didn't have to. The sheer weight of his presence seemed to shrink the room. You were my brother. I gave you my keys, my ledger, and my trust, and you used them to build a grave for a woman who has done nothing but survive. Trust. Ji-hoon spat, his grip on the silenced pistol tightening. You didn't trust me, Dae-hyun. You haven't trusted anyone since Yuna. You used me as a machine to process your blood money while you sat in the dark and counted your scars. I didn't build this grave for her. I built it for you. She was just a convenient way to make sure you never looked at the man standing right next to you. Ji-hoon's gaze flickered to the door for a split second, a micro-expression of a man planning an exit. But it doesn't matter now. The Philadelphia families are already moving on the docks. By morning, your empire will be a carcass, and I'll be on a plane to Seoul. You can die here with your ghost and your pride. You're not going to Seoul, Amara said, standing up from behind the desk. Her voice was trembling, but her eyes were fixed on Ji-hoon with a cold academic clarity. The bank in Seoul. I already sent a kill command to the server. The fractional transfers were illegal, Ji-hoon. I flagged them as suspected money laundering for a terrorist cell. That wallet is frozen. You have nothing. Ji-hoon's face went bloodless. The one thing he valued more than life, his exit strategy, had been erased by the girl he had called a distraction. With a snarl of pure desperation, he swung the gun toward Amara. No! Dae-hyun roared. The room erupted. Ji-hoon fired. The silenced thud was followed by the sound of glass shattering as the bullet missed Amara and hit the window behind her. Dae-hyun lunged, his massive frame covering the distance in 2 strides. He slammed into Ji-hoon, the force of the impact carrying them both over the desk and onto the floor. Amara scrambled back as the 2 men became a blur of violence. Ji-hoon was younger and faster, but Dae-hyun fought with the primal, unhinged strength of a man who was fighting for the only light he had found in 7 years of darkness. They tumbled across the rug, fists thudding against flesh, until Ji-hoon managed to shove the barrel of the gun against Dae-hyun's ribs. Dae-hyun, watch out! Amara screamed. She didn't think. She didn't have time to consider the risk or the ROI. She grabbed the heavy crystal award from the desk and swung it with both hands, slamming it into the back of Ji-hoon's head. The sound was sickening. Ji-hoon's eyes rolled back, his grip on the gun slackening as he slumped to the floor, unconscious. Dae-hyun rolled off him, gasping for air. His silk shirt was torn, and a deep gash above his eye was bleeding freely, the red liquid stark against his black tattoos. He stayed on the floor for a moment, his chest heaving, before his gaze found Amara. She was standing over them, the crystal award still clutched in her shaking hands, her breath coming in jagged hitches. She looked down at the man she had just saved, then at the man she had just incapacitated. The Columbia ghost had disappeared. In her place was a woman who had looked into the abyss and hadn't blinked. Dae-hyun stood up slowly, his movements pained. He didn't look at Ji-hoon. He walked straight to Amara. He reached out, his large scarred hands taking the crystal from her and setting it on the desk. Then, he did something he hadn't done in a lifetime. He pulled her into his arms, crushing her against his chest as if he were trying to pull her inside his own skin. You came back, he whispered into her hair, his voice breaking. You went on the ledge. You broke into the office. Why would you risk that for me? Because you're not a monster, Dae-hyun, she sobbed, finally letting the tears fall as she buried her face in the hollow of his shoulder. You're just a man who's been sitting in the dark for too long. And I'm not ready to let the light go out. He pulled back just enough to look at her, his hand cupping her face, his thumb wiping away a tear mixed with his own blood. I saw the code, Amara. Before I came in. I saw what you did. You didn't just find the money. You found the truth. I was so blind. I almost let him take you. He's gone now, she said, looking down at the fallen traitor. He's not the only one who's gone, Dae-hyun replied, his gaze intense. The man who didn't trust you is gone too. He leaned down and kissed her. Not the hard, possessive kiss of a mafia boss, but the desperate, searching kiss of a man who had finally found his way home. It tasted of salt, scotch, and the metallic tang of blood, but to Amara, it felt like the first breath of air after being underwater for years. The sound of sirens began to wail in the distance, echoing up from the streets of Manhattan. The syndicate's cleaners would be here soon to deal with Ji-hoon, but for now, in the ruins of the Forbidden Office, there were only the 2 of them. The aftermath of the storm didn't bring silence but a new kind of clarity. As the sun began to peek over the Atlantic, casting pale gold light across the blood-stained rug of the office, the penthouse was swarming with Dae-hyun's most trusted recovery team. Ji-hoon had been removed, not to a grave, but to a high-security holding facility where he would face the syndicate's version of a trial. The betrayal of a brother was a debt that could never be fully repaid, but for the first time in 7 years, Dae-hyun didn't feel the need to drown the world in blood to feel safe. Amara stood on the balcony, her tan blazer draped over her shoulders to ward off the morning chill. She watched the city wake up, the yellow taxis once again crawling like ants below. She felt a presence behind her, the familiar scent of cedar and the warmth of a man who had finally stopped fighting his own shadow. Dae-hyun stepped beside her, his hand sliding into hers. His knuckles were bruised, and a white bandage covered the cut above his eye, but the haunted look in his gaze had vanished. He looked at the horizon, not as a predator scanning for threats, but as a man seeing a new day. "I called the registrar at Columbia this morning," Dae-hyun said softly, his thumb tracing the back of her hand. "Your credits from the night classes have been transferred. You're graduating, Amara. Summa cum laude. You don't have to be a ghost anymore." Amara looked at him, her eyes filling with tears. "You didn't have to do that, Dae-hyun. I was going to finish it on my own." "I know you were," he replied, turning to face her. "That's why I did it. Because you're the only person I've ever met who didn't need me to be the boss. You just needed me to be a man who believed in you." 6 months later, the penthouse was no longer a fortress of suffocating darkness. The heavy drapes had been replaced with light, airy fabrics, and the forbidden room had been converted into a joint office where Amara managed the legal and philanthropic side of the Kong family's transition into legitimate enterprise. The wedding was small, held on the very terrace where Dae-hyun had once sat in the dark waiting for her. Amara wore a dress of ivory silk, her hair falling in soft curls, and for the first time, she wasn't wearing the tan blazer of a struggling student or the uniform of a maid. She was a partner. After the ceremony, Dae-hyun led her to a podium where a velvet-covered plaque stood. A small circle of their most trusted allies watched in silence. "I know you didn't want charity, and you never wanted to owe me anything," Dae-hyun said, his voice carrying over the rooftop with a newfound resonance. "So I wanted to make sure your mother's sacrifice was never forgotten. This isn't a gift to you. It's a gift to the world she raised you for." He pulled back the cloth to reveal the name, the Gloria Vance Foundation. He announced a $50 million endowment to help inner-city students in Chicago and New York gain access to the higher education that Amara had fought so hard to finish. Amara's breath hitched, her eyes filling with grateful, happy tears. She realized that her mother's legacy was no longer a story of struggle and medical debt but a bridge for thousands of others. Dae-hyun hadn't just given her a title or a ring. He had given her the power to heal the world that had once left her with only $47 in her bank account. As the city lights began to sparkle below like a million tiny stars, they shared their first dance as husband and wife. The girl from Chicago who had nothing and the Korean Mafia boss who thought he had everything had finally found the one thing they were actually looking for: a love built on trust, redemption, and a future where neither of them would ever have to sit in the dark alone again. "I love you," she whispered against his lips, the scent of the night air sweet around them. "I love you more," he replied, finally stepping out of the shadows and into the light of their new life together. Drop a comment below. Do you think Dae-hyun was right to be suspicious after what happened in his past, or should he have trusted Amara's integrity from the start? If you want to see more stories of redemption and dark romance, hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an update.